you have to say about the new guide, telling us how to defeat MAGA extremism.
Thanks so much for having me, Marla. I'm going to share my screen. Give me 1 minute.
What you have to say about the new guide, telling us how to defeat MAGA extremism.
Thanks so much for having me, Marla. I'm going to share my screen. Give me 1 minute.
What you have to say about the new guide, telling us how to defeat MAGA extremism.
Thanks so much for having me, Marla. I'm going to share my screen. Give me 1 minute.
What you have to say about the new guide, telling us how to defeat MAGA extremism. We're getting an echo, or at least I am. Is anyone else getting that?
Yes.
Yep.
Oh, seems like it's fixed itself. Okay. Hi, everybody.
Good.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Actually, I think I'm on. There we go. Thank you very much for having me today. I appreciate being here always. Indivisible is always putting out a guide every 2 years, like Marla mentioned, that coincides with the congressional session. So this will be technically our 3rd guide, although we do put out like papers in the in-between years as well. But this year, our guide is a practical guide to defeating MAGA mayhem. And I'll talk a little bit about these. These slides are pretty dense, so don't feel like you have to read them all. I'm happy to share them with Kyoko and Marla after the call if you want to send them out afterwards to be able to read them. I'm not going to read them verbatim, but I'll go through them. So the guide begins with a synopsis of what happened, and just talks a little bit about why MAGA Republicans actually won, and it was through a combination of voter suppression, historical patterns that the president's party loses seats in midterms, and successful political messaging, particularly on inflation and crime. Unfortunately, the MAGA Republicans did win the House, which ended our Democratic trifecta, and that means it closes our window for transformative legislation in the next 2 years. And like I mentioned, this talks a little bit more about why the trend of the president's party loses in the midterms. But the Republicans were banking on this being a quote unquote red wave and a blowout of victories in this cycle, which we were able to tamp with some conventional wisdom and limiting their losses and gaining grounds in critical states, even gaining a Senate seat. It's not just historical trends we're up against a litany of right-wing forces that have spent decades chipping away at our democracy and our democratic institutions, particularly like the right-wing Supreme Court gutting our Voting Rights Act, which turned up an uptick in voter suppression tactics. It's designed to give a disproportionate number of seats to the minority of the population, which heavily advantages the Republican Party, because as we know, if it was a fair system, Democrats would win. I'm going through these fairly quickly because there's actually quite a few slides. These are made by our lovely design team. But like I said, they're pretty dense and there's quite a lot of them. The guide itself is only 17 pages, so you don't have to worry about it being super dense. It's an easy read. And it goes through sections, what happened and what we can do about it, and tactics that we want to employ. Those are sort of the 3 sections that it breaks up into. So if I'm going a little bit quick for anybody, just holler at me. So Democrats didn't have a strong enough response to, like I said, inflation and crime, leaving them vulnerable on these key issues. And the GOP's message was on prices going up was uniquely powerful because it's something that everybody is impacted by daily. And if it weren't for our Democrats like Kristen Sinema blocking Biden's agenda, we could have seen a much stronger, more unified message and policy response. Unfortunately, we have Sinema and Manchin still. We talk about in the guide, there are big wins we're celebrating. Like I said, we did pick up a Senate seat. We also won Democratic trifectas at the state level in Michigan, Minnesota, Maryland, and Massachusetts. We elected John Fetterman to the Pennsylvania State House, and we held congressional seats Republicans spent millions on. So we did have a formula to win. Democrats also did really good things with their trifecta, providing significant policies that we're able to point to and that Democrats were able to campaign on. So why the path forward gives us hope. What our main goals are with this guide are twofold. Number one, we want to make Democrats champions to fight back against the MAGA mayhem that we're going to see over the next 2 years. We want to fight for important wins and sell those wins to the public. So messaging is critical. And then we want to also define the GOP as the unpopular extremists that they are. So we want to uplift their right-wing extremism and amplify their messaging so that people know these are not the party. This is not the party that we want to champion in 2024, which this guide is really setting us up for what we want to do in 2024, to be able to have a successful win and hopefully take back all the levers of power. So we're going to need an even stronger and broadly appealing Democratic identity that voters feel reflected by, and that makes it easier for Democrats to accomplish the big wins they have majorities in. Voters grow tired of political gridlock or other cliches that are the result of Democrats failing to boldly pursue a popular agenda, which is why Democrats have to feel like a team and have a good, successful team that millions of voters are going to want to be a part of. That's why the messaging is critical. This Democratic team is going to need to challenge the powers that benefit from the status quo. So we're going to have to uplift things like the messaging of what the Republicans have done in just the last week that they've been in power. Not only have they tried to have a nationwide ban on abortion, they've also tried to gut the IRS, and they did something else that made me angry this week that I'll think of probably later. But Democrats have to make it clear that they're fighting for a democracy and an economy that works for all of us instead of just the super wealthy and well-connected. Oh, they made tax cuts for the rich. That's right. No surprises there. So we got to shine a bigger light on GOP extremism, which we know is both dangerous and unpopular. And those are really the keys. They're not advantageous to the American populace, and they're already wildly unpopular. So the more we can message and show the party as already too extreme for the American public, and the Democrats being champions of the issues that are impacting people's daily lives, the more well-positioned we are to retake our levers of power in 2024. The Republicans have taken a big gamble by adopting these extreme views on everything, and we need to make sure they continue to pay the political price for that vulnerability. So we need to make Democrats broadly appealing and make the Republican brand, like it says, so repulsive that folks don't want to be associated with supporting their platforms. So we need to really be messaging around George Santos, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz, and all of those extremists, that they're not just the only ones that are holding these positions that are very extreme, that the rest of the GOP is supporting these positions by, like Kevin McCarthy, succumbing to their extremist demands in order to obtain speakership, and the very real things that he had to give up that detrimentally affect the American population. I think we already know the stakes. We have minimized the Republican gains this cycle, but GOP is still a serious threat, particularly when it comes to the financial powers of the House. And there is a threat of a mega blowout in 2024. There's also a threat of a coup in 2024. Even if they can't win these elections outright, the leaders at the highest level of the Republican Party have been prepping for a coup attempt. And Indivisible is laser focused on preventing both of these outcomes from happening. And we have a path to doing that. Like I said, we have to shine more light on the GOP extremism, and we need to make the Democratic team more broadly appealing. And these are monumental tasks. But Indivisible was founded on this basis. We know how to do this. We fought Trumpism, starting in 2017. And this is another opportunity for us to go back to our roots and utilize the tactics we already have been doing and that we know are in our bones to do. We're going to have to employ those tactics in order to be able to stop a 2024 coup and MAGA wins. And a little bit about the important coup attempt in 2024. We think Trump and the GOP have tried to overturn the legitimate results of Democratic elections in 2020, and they've some of them, like Carrie Lake in 2022, but they're going to try it again in 2024. They plan to steal future elections by any means necessary to win or retain control of key state legislators and have them empowered by the MAGA SCOTUS that we have, and use that power to declare a Republican winner in 2024. But through our hard work in this past election cycle, their path to executing that strategy was very much narrowed. We can't let up while the MAGA legislators continue making plans to completely toss out the election results if they produce Democratic wins in 2024. So we have battleground states. A handful of battleground states are most likely to decide the next presidential elections and are most at risk of a potential coup attempt. These states are on the front lines for several reasons, including they have at least one chamber of the legislature being controlled by Republicans, or they have election administration positions like the Secretary of State held by Republicans. So we are focusing on these specific states to diminish MAGA's foothold and shrink their opportunities for election subversion. Fortunately, the same strategies that we're deploying, like I said, we already have at our strengthen our coalition, and delegitimize MAGA at the national level are going to work at the same state level as well. And you can also take a look at our state guide, which we put out in 2020. Actually, I think we put out the states guide in 2024. This might be our fourth. This might be our fourth guide. Our states guide was in 2018. So we have a whole guide on how to focus on the states. So what's going to happen in Congress in 2023 and 2024? Without a governing trifecta, our processes for transformative legislation just simply don't exist. We're not going to see the gains like the IRA that we have in our past legislative cycle. We're not going to be able to take action to combat things like climate crisis or enact policies that are going to make the economy work for all of us. Republicans are going to take hostage, particularly of the levers of power that impact our financial systems, and engage in sabotage to undermine the Biden administration. So we're going to see threats of government shutdowns, very unreasonable demands like Social Security cuts and Medicare cuts. They're going to talk about things like the debt ceiling and refuse to engage on urgent legislation like disaster response, which we're likely to have since we are in the middle of a climate emergency. They're also sure to use the majority to undertake politically motivated investigations against President Biden to gin up controversy like we've already seen in regards to Biden having some classified documents that he voluntarily turned in. He didn't have to have a subpoena or hide them from the American public. And like I said, our game plan is simple and it's a twofold strategy. One, to make the Republicans and their unpopular extremism toxic brand, make sure everyone knows how out of touch they are, and to make the Democratic Party more broadly appealing so that we can win and maintain majorities. And how we're going to do that is consistently pushing Democratic representatives to fight against the MAGA agenda and to be those fighters and champions speaking out. We want to see them on the news. We want to see them in their communities every day talking about how MAGA is dangerous and how it's unpopular. We know the Republican playbook. They're going to sabotage everything not nailed to the floor, demonize vulnerable communities like immigration. They're going to force votes that can divide Democrats. We saw that on the abortion issue. They're going to investigate Biden and his family. We already see that being undertaken. And of course, they're going to attack progressives in Congress. This isn't something that is unusual and something that we're going to be shocked by. We know because they did the same thing when Obama was office, and they're going to use that same playbook again because it actually is what's been working for them. But our playbook is expose the MAGA extremism. We're going to set the agenda. We're going to talk about things that we want to see happen, and we're going to mitigate the harm of the legislation that they are able to get passed. So in order to do that, we have to not take the GOP bait and stand together to protect each other. Like I said, it needs to feel like a Democratic team that's appealing to them, and not the divisiveness of the Republican Party and extremist right-wing factions versus quote unquote moderate Republicans. We need to have them all seem like they're on one team and all of the Democrats are on another team, particularly when it comes to women of color and immigrants. We need Democrats to protect each other in these moments. And we won't allow Republicans that have traditionally divided Democrats in the past to do that again. Like I said, we're all on one team. We play right into their hand if we take the bait and see vulnerable Democrats distancing themselves from the party and voting with Republicans. But our agenda is the popular agenda. It's the one that appeals to most of Americans. And vulnerable members should receive backup from our movement when they stick to it and keep the caucus together. So some things that we know about our Republican MOCs is that their ideas are wildly unpopular. They're scared of people knowing about the truth of their unpopular ideas. They don't have the answers to questions about their unpopular ideas, and they're going to run from having to answer for those ideas at every opportunity. So in this upcoming recess, we have put out a call to action to bird dog Republicans during the recess and get them on record about things that are unpopular, as well as for Democrats and Republicans alike. We have some LTE tools and asking them to, for Democrats to be strong fighters and champions for the team Democrats, and asking us to villainize the policies that Republicans are putting forth already, and let them know that they are wildly unpopular. Democratic members of Congress are interested in the path of least resistance, unfortunately. They want to avoid bad news coverage and, of course, have good news coverage. They're going to pass the buck to Biden and claim that there's little that they can do. And they don't want to be seen as hypocritical or flip-flopping on their previous positions. So we can use these things to our advantage and get them on record for the things that they've already committed to in their campaigning, and make sure that we're holding them accountable for being those champions. If they're not being vocal and they're not out there on the news and in their communities talking about these, what the Republican agenda is doing to Americans, then they're not being champions. They're being complicit in the work that they're doing by not making sure that we are all identifying them with extremism. Again, we're going to brand the GOP as toxic. And how we're going to do that is there's some GOP members that are in more competitive districts that are more susceptible to this pressure. And those are 18 districts that we've identified, the 18 districts that Biden carried that are represented by Republicans now, 5 of which are in California. We have California's 13, Adam Gray. We have, or Adam's, not Adam Gray. Adam Gray ran in that district. We have California's 22, represented by Valadeo. I think we have 27, which is Mike Garcia. And then California 41 and 45, I believe, are Michelle Steele and that have participated.
Oh, okay. That's all right if you don't know it offhand.
What was that?
Oh, I was just going to say, that's all right if you don't know it offhand, the 5th
Oh,
congressional district, because I was just going to look it up myself, but that's fine. We can move
that
on.
would be great. Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, so we're going to try to build up indivisibles in the districts. We do have an indivisible in our Southern California districts, but with redistricting, California's 13 doesn't have an indivisible group active. So we're going to try to reactivate our chapters there because we want to do things that we've seen be successful in other races, like particularly in John Fetterman's race, how indivisibles in Pennsylvania really stepped up to the plate and did a lot of public displays, like the crudité, dressing up like broccoli, those things that get a lot of attention and then that reverberate on the news cycles. We're really trying to use those types of tactics to be able to vilify the Republican Party, and particularly in these 18 districts. So that's why we want to make sure that we get some indivisibles that can take those actions in those communities. So I mentioned some of the critical actions that we have already up on our website, calling for bird dogging if you have an MOC that is a Republican, calling for bird dogging for the recess, and for both Democrats and Republicans alike. We have letters to the editor templates, as well as some calls. When we're making calls for Republicans, we're going to be telling them in uncertain terms that we don't like their policies and we want to see them do better. And for Democrats, we're going to thank them for the stands that they've taken, if they have taken a stand, and we've seen them be vocal on the news, and we're going to push them to be fighters if we haven't. It's important to remember that we are the grassroots, and activists, like the thousands of indivisible volunteers across the country, refuse to give ground in the resurgent MAGA coalition that helped to guide in this new majority. We want to make sure that they are
Dennessa, we can't hear you. Or at least I can't.
easier. Our internet, because of the storms, has been a little bit spotty.
Oh, okay.
I'm
Yeah,
so
you cut
sorry.
out for just a bit there. That's all right.
This is me wrapping up, actually. Just wanting to reiterate that grassroots activists across the country are what kept the Republicans at bay in this last election, and we're going to be really the foothold to hold them accountable, and to be the mouthpieces for our Democratic team, our team Democrats that we want to see really banding together and reverberating the message that the GOP is toxic. And again, I want to reiterate that we want to make sure we're not just saying that the right-wing faction of the GOP is toxic. We want to brand them all together and make sure that we are calling them out as a group. They are one team, and the Democrats are one team. We need to stand together against this other team. And so that is what we are asking our indivisibles to do with this guide, is to really use the tactics that we have used under our Trumpist original guide, to be able to push our members of Congress to be those fighters and to really push the GOP into the extremist territory that we know that it is in the news cycles. So that's what we're doing with our guide this year. And that's what we are hoping to see. More office visits, more of those standard tactics, more office visits happening and being put on social media, being picked up by the news cycles, more things like activism, I don't know if anybody was able to attend, but Indivisible East Bay held a Artivism event for the January 6th vigils last weekend or the weekend before. It was last weekend, where they did this really cool thing where they had like a football goalpost up and they put Team Democracy versus Team Fascism, and the score was like 22-21 because it's really close, but Team Democracy is still winning, and we want to make sure Team Democracy does win. We want to do things like that to really grab press attention and keep the constant beating drum in the narrative that the Team Democrats are where the interests of the people lie, and beat that drum that the GOP is extremist. So we're going to use those traditional tactics that we've been using since the beginning of Indivisible to be able to do that. And I know that Indivisible and our Livermore Indivisible in particular are particularly good at that. So I'm looking forward to seeing all of the things that you all do.
Thanks, Dennessa. We had one question, which was, what is bird dogging? Do you want to explain what Indivisible means when we talk about bird dogging?
Yeah, bird dogging is when you basically follow your member around from place to place. Like, you know that they're going to be at the county fair, or you want to catch them when they're at the airport. You'll see them, you'll see on the news people following their member of Congress and asking them questions, particularly hard-hitting questions. I think one of the most famous ones is there was a girl that got a member of Congress. Oh gosh, I'm spacing who it was, but they got him on record about immigration, for instance, in an elevator, and it went viral. And
Jeff Flake, wasn't it? Jeff Flake?
Jeff Flake, that's right. Yeah, so bird dogging is making sure that you show up at each event and you keep asking questions and you pester them until they are on record about things that are really important. And you record it is the most important part. You're recording it, and you can send that to your news outlets. And in case you missed a press release, you can post it on your social medias, and those types of things tend to go viral or get picked up by news cycles, and that keeps those issues and the fact that they are terrible on those issues in the public narrative.
Thanks. Yeah, that was helpful. I think we kind of heard those expressions over the years, and so it's useful to get your perspective on what we mean by when we talk about bird dogging. If anyone else has any questions, please put them in the Q&A. I had one question I wanted to ask you, Dennessa, and that was about messaging. You talked a number of times about how important the messaging is and how the Democrats aren't as successful at that as the GOP, in part, I think, because we have a more complicated message to send than they do in general. And we also don't have the coordinated right-wing media or media atmosphere that they can rely on. We don't have anything like that. So I'm wondering what Indivisible, if anything, will be promoting as far as messaging. I know there's like the Truth Brigade that Indivisible has, but is there anything else about messaging that Indivisible wanted to sort of amplify this time? I just think that there are some good people, good communicators out there that are exploring the topic of messaging on the progressive side, like through the research collaboration and Anat Shenker-Osorio and people like that. So I'm just wondering if Indivisible was going to be coordinating with them more closely to try to get the message out and have, all progressives sort of singing the same tune, essentially, because, we know that the more people hear something, the more true it is to them. And if we're all saying different things, it doesn't, and Republicans are all saying something else, they believe the Republicans because they think that that is true because they just hear it more often. Absolutely. Anyway, that was a long question, but I guess it's about messaging and what Indivisible, if anything, is going to be doing about that going forward.
Well, a couple of things, like with the Research Collaborative, Indivisible, as well as other progressive organizations like Move On, Color Change, We Make the Road, those types of organizations, we all sit on a table together and talk about messaging. So we coordinate in that way to make sure that we are sort of amplifying similar messaging. It might look a little bit different, from group to group, but the core of the messaging tends to be the same. So we definitely do collaborate with those other progressive organizations to make sure that we have that. And then we have a couple of campaigns that you'll see rolling out through this year, where we're going to be doing a lot more deep canvassing, and not just in rural communities where we've been doing a lot of deep canvassing. And last year we also did some deep canvassing around abortion issues in battleground states. We're going to be doing a lot more deep canvassing just in local communities and giving groups the tools to be able to do that deep canvassing in their communities directly, so that they can have those important conversations and take the messages from places like ASOS and that we're putting out and amplify it in their own communities. And then we also have a campaign coming up that is really just to hype the IRA. We already see some, signs coming out across the state, like this bridge is sponsored by the IRA, or
Inflation Reduction Act.
yes. So yeah, well, we want to really amplify the fact that this, really landmark piece of legislation is impacting people in a real direct way. And we're going to do that through a race class narrative. So we want to make sure that we're talking to people, specifically people of color and marginalized communities, about that, and make sure that they understand the impact that legislation can have on their direct lives. Everything is political, but people hate to talk about politics. So we want to make sure that people are understanding that the politics is their everyday life. And that's part of the messaging we're going to bring to folks as well.
Great, that sounds good. Was there any other questions? I know there was one question. It sounded more legislative. It was about the debt ceiling.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if that's something you can really respond to, Dennessa. That's something we would have asked, or we're going to ask if she shows up, the representative for Senator Padilla. So I don't see any other questions.
I'm not super versed on how to answer that question, but I know that was part of the reason that the Democrats stayed a little bit longer in session last year, during what they normally call the lame duck session, because they wanted to make sure that the debt ceiling was passed for the longest amount of time possible. So they passed it all the way through the end of next year. But we're likely to see some additional like ploys, about cutting Social Security and Medicare when it comes time to readdress the debt ceiling, both in June-ish and in September-ish. But I can't really speak to where it belongs in terms of the process, unfortunately. That's our policy team. That's really good at that.
Yeah. Okay, Christine, did you want to say something about that?
No, I think you've covered it, and Dennessa has covered it with her comment that she's not that up on the policy issues and what might be thought about the debt ceiling and the problems around that. So that's fine. Thank you.
Are there any other questions to ask Dennessa about the Indivisible Guide, or just even more generally, maybe Indivisible's goals and aspirations for the year? I mean, it sounds like we, have our work cut out for us, just in dealing with the House of Representatives and what might be happening there, and also the fact that probably any good legislation that we would want to come out of Congress won't be coming out this year or next year. So it's not, we won't have that good messaging to sort of rely on as we did in the last, in the midterms, where the Democrats had made some progress on some things. Anything else? Yeah, Christine?
A comment and sort of a question. I know one of the goals for that we have to have, and that you've mentioned, is that we have to have more Democrats, be voting Democratic and increase our majority, especially heading into the 2024 election cycle. And you've mentioned, some tactics on how to do that by calling out Republicans and, the negativity and the really bad tactics that they've used. I'm just wondering how to appeal to more Democrats who are more centrist than we progressives are or are seen. There's a one side of painting the Republicans for who they are, but how can we improve our own image in the eyes of those people that we also would like to, pull closer and get out to vote on behalf of the country?
Yeah, I mean, that's tough. And because the Democratic Party is really sort of the big tent, and we have the gamut of positions on things, from very centrist to super progressive. Like Marla was talking about earlier, it's harder to message for us because we have a lot of varying and not necessarily settled opinions. So for more centrist folks, I think we would treat them more, if you have more progressive values than them, we would treat them more like Republicans and get them on record for the things that, are not popular positions. If they are, the type of people that are not pro a woman's right to choose, for instance. We have a few Republicans that are like that, or a few Democrats that have that position. Then we want to get them on record talking about that position, and we would talk about how wildly unpopular that is, and how people, how I think it's up to almost 80% of Americans think a woman should have a right to choose. So when we wouldn't want to treat them more like Republicans and holding them accountable to, and holding them accountable to the positions that they ran on too. A lot of times we got centrists that are centrist for votes, they're centrist for the election, and then they have different positions when they become in office, holding them accountable to the things that they ran on. And talking about things that are progressive policies like universal health care, for instance. Not a lot of people outside of the progressive circles think that universal health care is necessarily the right path. But talking about how everybody deserves healthcare should be a human right, and everybody and nobody out should be just sort of the default. Everybody deserves healthcare, everybody deserves housing, everybody deserves food security. Talking about our progressive positions on that, which really aren't that progressive, right? They're just sort of like a human decency thing. But talking about those positions and getting a conversation going with your member of Congress about that, those are going to be really huge wins.
Yeah, thank you. There was a question also about whether you've noticed other or indivisible groups having problems attracting, keeping, and engaging members, and if there are suggestions for people to become more active. I think we've kind of noticed with our group, we had, during 2017, 2018, maybe even 2019, pretty good group of active members. And then it kind of dropped off over the pandemic. And then, after Biden won, I think people sort of heaved a sigh of relief and and moved on with other things in their lives. And so I'm just sort of wondering if you have suggestions for re-engaging folks on, what we're trying to do since the work isn't done.
Yeah, for sure. It's not just your group. There are a lot of groups that are having trouble retaining their members, and not necessarily because they don't think that the work that they're doing is valuable, but because it's hard and you're doing this work for free, and it can be like a full-time job sometimes, especially if you're planning an event. And there's a lot of groups that have smaller leadership teams. Sometimes they just have a team of 1 or 2. And like I said, it's a full-time job for them to be able to manage a group. So that leads to a lot of burnout. And when you hit a wall like the pandemic, or you come up against, the fact that we have a Democratic trifecta now, it makes sense to be able to feel like you want to take a break then. So how to re-engage those members? We have a great program called Indivisible, where we give up to $1,000 a year for you just to have a social or multiple socials to bring members back to the fold, do something in person if possible, because the indivisible groups are not just groups that get together to talk politics and to like commiserate, but really it's a social movement as well. People have made, really great friendships out of this movement, and they've found comfort in knowing that there's other people that share their same ideals, and having that sense of social connection is also really important to the movement. So I would encourage your group, if you're not using that now, to use our Indivisible program, which was renewed for 2023. So you have a whole new set of $1,000 to use to be able to buy food or rent a venue or whatever it is that you want to do. So re-engaging in the social issue and direct outreach to folks. You can use a MailChimp or whatever it is that you use to be able to send out newsletters and stuff, but that's not necessarily going to reach the people that might be reinvigorated if you ask them to come back on one-on-one situations. So maybe reaching out, having a call-a-thon, and having, a handful of members actually call past members and say, hey, we're doing X, Y, and Z. Usually you want to have an ask or two to be able to bring them back to. So we're having a social coming up, or we're doing this event to commemorate the January 6th insurrection. Can you come out to it? Or can you bring cookies to the social? Or just asking people for something and to be part of something is going to really re-engage folks, and letting them know, come from a place of passion that you're scared for the state of our democracy under this new Republican House, and what could happen in 2024 with a possible looming coup on the horizon. So really just saying that this is the time to come back. If you had to step away for your own, reasons, this is a time to come back and make an ask of them to re-engage, and make it not a big ask, something small, like I said, bringing cookies to something, or just showing up to run a table at your event, or if they can't do that, just be at the event. But if you have a specific ask of folks, people will usually come back. I think those personal connections are really the important thing to be able to re-engage folks, which you can do in part for some people through a newsletter, but you really, for organizing purposes, those one-on-one conversations are where everything can change.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, I think there's some comments in the chat too about having those one-on-one conversations and in-person events that have worked for Mom's Demand, that might be helpful here. There is another question in the Q&A. What is a good response when a right-leaning person claims the left is socialist?
Socialist. Well, I'm personally not anti-socialist, so that may be a little bit difficult for me, but I just say that socialism is sort of like a buzzword of the Republican Party. Have asked people, do they really know what socialism is? And it's sort of it's a belief that we all deserve some human rights and human dignity, and have policies that reflect that. So I would just combat them and say, actually, do you know what socialism is? And say, the Democratic Party has a wide range of people that have different beliefs, from some that claim to be democratic socialists to some that are more centrist, like we were talking about earlier. And have a conversation with them about one issue, and don't talk about socialism necessarily, but talk about the issue that, they ask them what's important to them, what troubles them and keeps them up at night, and have a conversation about that one thing. And share something. When you give something of yourself, you get something in return from people a lot of the time. So if you're vulnerable and tell them a story about your own life that relates to something that is vexing to them, like when I'm at the doors talking to people canvassing, and I ask, what's important to you, what keeps you up at night, you'll hear people say, oh, well, my mom has cancer, and we're on Medicaid and they can't necessarily afford these drugs. Oh yeah, that's really important to me too. I think our healthcare should be a human right. People shouldn't have to, mortgage their house to be able to afford drugs that are going to be life-saving for them. The drug companies shouldn't jack up the prices of these drugs when the American public is the one funding them. So you can really have a conversation about one thing, and don't make it about socialism. Have a conversation about what is important to them. And that really will draw people in to be like, oh, okay, well, that sounds like something that I'm interested in, something that seems totally reasonable. Make it seem like something that's reasonable, because it is.
Yeah, good answer. Is there any other question? I don't think I saw anything else. I think that is it for you, Dennessa. Thank you again for taking the time, especially this week, which must be very hectic for you with the house problems and the rain and everything. So I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So our intention was to go to Senator Padilla's representative, but I don't think she has joined us. Is that true, Kyoko?
Yes, and I have been trying to get contact with her, but she's not answering in any way, so I don't think we can get hold of her.
Yeah, so I don't think we won't be able to continue that portion of the meeting. I can just tell you the things that we sent in advance, some questions to Senator Padilla's office to ask about immigration policies, noting that Senator Padilla had issued a joint press release with a few other senators expressing disappointment in President Biden's new immigration policies, which extend Title 42 and impose a transit ban on the southern border. And so we wanted to know what Senator Padilla would do specifically to address that issue, the issue of immigration more broadly. And then also what we wanted to know from the senator, what we could do to help Dreamers get a pathway to citizenship and expand the DREAM Act program. And we had a couple questions about the federal judiciary, since Senator Padilla is on the Judiciary Committee in the Senate. There are 4 vacancies in California federal courts, and we wanted to know if he's nominated people for those positions for Biden to review and place into nomination, and then also whether the Judiciary Committee will pick up its pace to confirm nominees even more quickly than they have been, especially now that they'll have more control over the Senate committees this session. And then also, we wanted to ask Senator Padilla about his view on court reform and whether there'd be any progress made on that, at least in looking at some of these issues about expanding the court, including the Supreme Court, and finding ways to make it, to rebalance and make it less partisan and less polarizing. We had some other questions. There were some questions in the Q&A as well about the debt ceiling issue. We wanted to ask him that, and the COVID funding, why that wasn't extended when we had the chance last session. And Dennessa, if you can respond to any of these, if you know any responses, that's great. If not, that's fine too. This was really intended for Senator Padilla's office. And then a question about as a member of the Environment and Public Works Committee, what would he see as the committee's most urgent legislative priority this session? We had a question about the Equal Rights Amendment and what he would do to, or what would he suggest for strategies for proponents of the ERA to finally recognize the adoption of the amendment? How would, on the issue of executive action, since we know that the House will likely hold up any kind of legislation that President Biden and the democratically controlled Senate would want to do, will Senator Padilla encourage and support the Biden administration in mitigating some of that harm by, supporting executive action that President Biden might take? And then finally, we had a question about the January 6th investigation. Now that the House committee has been disbanded, would the Senate sort of take up some of that work and look into some of the areas that the House committee had recommended be followed up on, including, the issue of the law enforcement response or lack thereof on, to calls for the, because they knew ahead of time that there would likely be violence. Why wasn't there a better response? And then some of the ways that the House and Senate can enforce civil subpoena authority, threats to election workers, and other recommendations that the January 6th committee had put out. So we wanted to know if the Senate would be taking up some of those issues now that the House won't be able to, at least the House Democrats won't be able to. Let's see, Dennessa, I think did you respond to something in the chat?
I just mentioned that I'm interested in seeing Padilla's response to the current Title 42 extension, because he was a really strong advocate for it ending before. He's also a really big champion of climate justice as well. So I'd be interested in hearing some of his stances on that.
Yeah, I think we will certainly follow up with them and try to see if we can get answers and, some of these questions, and maybe send them out if we do, or invite them back for another meeting. I'm not sure what happened. It could be an issue similar to what you had, Dennessa, maybe something storm related. I don't know. Internet outage. I mean, it could be anything.